Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome. We're really looking forward to this discussion today. I think all of us have a chance to learn a lot from these distinguished panelists. Before we start, the first thing I need to do is the standard thing, ask you to please turn your cell phones off so that we can have this session uninterrupted. I'm going to give brief introductions to the panel, very brief. We could spend the whole morning doing the introductions, and we're not going to do that. And then I've asked each one of them to give a 5 to 7 minute opener to give their at least initial take. Our topic, as you know, is the future of global agriculture. Very broad topic. They'll give you their perspective, their take on at least some initial thoughts that are designed to seed questions and comments from you. We've set this up deliberately to put most of the time into questions and answers. And so as they're giving their opening comments, I encourage you to be thinking about things that you'd like to pursue further with them. So let me introduce them. I'll start on my left with Tom Hertel. Tom is a distinguished professor in agricultural economics at Purdue. He's a fellow of the American Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. He's a past president of that association. He's the founder and currently executive director of the Global Trade Analysis Project. It's a global project that's actually headquartered at Purdue. You might be surprised to know that Purdue is the global repository for data and analysis on trade and protection, and Tom has been the leader of that effort. To Tom's right is Mr. Robert Zoellich, very distinguished individual, former president of the World Bank, probably the leading figure in international trade and development issues. He was U.S. Trade Representative, Undersecretary of State, senior executive at Goldman Sachs, and lots of other prominent positions. We're very, very fortunate to have him. And to his right is John Hardin. If John were doing his introduction, John would say, "I'm just a farmer." And it's true, he is a farmer. In fact, he has been an Indiana master farmer. He's past president of the U.S. Pork Producers Association. He's been very active in international trade negotiations in agriculture. In fact, he's been an assistant and part of an advisory panel to the U.S. Trade Representative and to the Secretary of Agriculture. He's a member of the Purdue Board of Trustees, and a very effective member at that. And he's a trustee for the Farm Foundation and the National Farmland Trust, among many other activities that John undertakes. And to his right is Allan Gray. Allan Gray is Land O'Lakes chair in food and agribusiness in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue. He's the director of the Purdue Center for Food and Agricultural Business. He's director of the Purdue, and you may not believe this, Purdue Indiana University program, MBS MBA program in ag business. We do occasionally cooperate. And he's well known globally in agricultural business circles. So we'll begin the program, like I said, giving each of them 5 to 7 minutes, and then welcome your questions. If you don't have questions, I do, so you better come up with some. Mr. Zoellich.
Okay. Well, thank you, Wally, and let me thank all of you for coming to this event. I am an old friend of your new president, Mitch Daniels, so I was delighted to receive his invitation and that of the department. But in addition to the contact with Mitch, this really was a real pleasure because, as you could hear from some of the introductions, I've been working in different capacities in sort of trade, agriculture, development, the intersection, and Purdue is at the heart of that process. The GTAP program and project that Tom has developed is one that really does have sort of worldwide applicability. And John and I have had a chance, it's a wonderful example of somebody who as a farmer, has a very global perspective and tried to support us in the trade negotiations. And as I'll talk about a little bit later in some of the other events, I think the agribusiness connection, again, that Allan has been a part of in terms of looking beyond the farm to fork and all the things in between is very important. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And particularly for this topic, and this may be one that we'll get a little varying of views on, but I think world agriculture is facing a very important structural shift. And I think this change has major implications for growth, hunger and nutrition, overcoming poverty, business opportunities, R&D and technology, the environment. But I sense that the possibilities and the dislocations are not well appreciated. So let me get us started with 5 points. First, I believe in this structural shift because I see 3 big changes taking place: population, income, and urbanization. In 2000, we had about 6 billion people on the earth. We have 7 billion today. We expect 8 billion in 2025 and 9 billion by 2050. But in addition to the population growth, the income growth is most rapid in the most populous regions. And on top of that, you have a very quick urbanization process. China is about 50% urbanized today. By 2030, it's estimated to be about 70% urbanized. South Asia's will go from about 30% urbanization to 55% by 2050. Latin America is already heavily urbanized. Africa is moving to urbanization. So as you start to get the urbanization and the income effects, you start to see significant dietary changes, and not the least of which is a shift to meat and then on to processed projects. Just to give you a summary sense of this, the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, estimates that farmers will have to produce 50% more food by the year 2050 if you consider all agricultural output. Tom and I were talking about this yesterday. So non-food agricultural, you really get to 70 to 100%. Second, at the same time we're going to see this increase in demand, we now face constraints on greater production that we didn't really have before, whether they're land, water, climate change, labor, societal pressures. And again, just to give you a flavor of this, agricultural already accounts for about 70% of the world's freshwater consumption. In China and India, that's 90%. 80% of the new tropical agricultural land over the past decade came from clearing forests with a huge array of costs. So my third point is the world will need to increase agricultural productivity, and the greatest potential is in the developing world. And to do this, the challenge will be to work all along the value chain, from property rights and basic seeds and fertilizers all the way through inputs, production. About 50% of the agricultural product of sub-Saharan Africa is lost in storage. So there's huge potential gains, and there's a lot of knowledge that's been gained in the developed world in terms of trying to increase this productivity. And if we do this properly, it offers great potential in terms of overcoming poverty, boosting growth, and importantly, improving women's prospects. In sub-Saharan Africa, most of the primary agriculture producers are women. Fourth, given this long-term growth trend for demand, but also the relatively low stocks-to-use ratios, I believe the new normal won't just be increased demand, but it'll be continued uncertainty and volatility around this new trend line. And one of the best anecdotes I can share with you on this comes from a Purdue graduate, J.B. Penn, who was a colleague of mine when he was Undersecretary of Agriculture and I was the trade representative. He's now the chief economist for John Deere. And when we were discussing this a couple months ago, he said, you know, we now live in a world where within 45 days, the price of a bushel of corn could be $4 or it could be $20 based primarily on forecasts. And you see this in lots of other aspects when you saw the food price spikes. The relatively low stocks create much greater potential for volatility. And my final point is that for all these big changes, it's my sense that agricultural policies in the United States and elsewhere are still based on assumptions of the late 20th century. And the key assumption is that we live in a world of chronic surpluses instead of today's challenge, which is of increasing demand with periodic shortages.
Thank you. John.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a privilege for me to be on this platform and in this company. And I'll try to offer my perspective of the rich world that I've had to deal with in trade negotiations over the years. And also to make the comment that when I was a student at Purdue, there were about 3 billion people in the world, and about 1 billion of them lived on $1 a day or less. Today there are 7. There are still about 1 billion who live on $1 a day or less. And that's a tribute to the way we have opened up the world's economy, even though we all know we haven't begun to go far enough. So I'd like to share a few observations in my experience as a cleared advisor to our trade negotiators, and perhaps vent a frustration or two. There have been many times when I was at the briefing table or in an input session where I thought if my farm neighbors could be present and hear what was going on, they would think, what a colossal waste of time, because it often felt like a half a step forward and 2 steps back. That's the nature of this. But I will remind you, in my personal experience, when I started cheerleading for more trade access for pork in 1985, we exported $100 million worth of pork. Last year, we did $6.2 billion worth of pork. Now, I don't think there are many American industries that can claim that sort of competitiveness. And it's been quite a ride to experience it. And things didn't magically get better, but they certainly got different. Americans can make no particular claim on virtue when it comes to trade policy. Our Congress regularly passes farm bills that violate trade agreements we've already signed. It has been particularly frustrating to me in that many bilateral negotiations where the political power of the U.S. industries that sought border protection trumped early access for our most competitive products and industries. I remember one bit of political theater that I was part of in the House Ag Committee when I sat there and listened to sugar, rice, and cotton give their presentation while I waited to speak at that time for both the beef and pork industries. Now, I was representing an industry with a value of $60 billion a year, and those white commodities were just a tiny fraction of that. But I think but they were given precedence over us. And I think it reminds me of one of my favorite lines from Earl Butz, his definition of an honest politician. When you buy them, they stay bought. And it has been my experience as oftentimes before I would go to the government briefings, as I befriended the folks who were professional who represented these industries in trade negotiations, I can usually find out what the European Union or the Japanese were doing before it was time for the trade briefing that was supposed to be secure. So in my view, that the growing economies of the Pacific Rim offer the greatest opportunities for expanding food exports. A citizen of Japan has 1/60th the arable land to support and feed him that you have as a citizen of the United States. As these societies prosper, and in the area I'm at, eat more meat, there comes a number of challenges because all societies prefer domestically produced food. The challenge becomes how these areas with very small land bases, where livestock manures essentially need to be treated as municipal waste, feed themselves. And I will also remind you that it takes 20 times the freight to ship the feed for beef as it does to ship the beef primal that we export. And when you think about climate change and efficiency and making the world better, these things have a place. A few challenges. We have to resist as best we can the imposition of trade standards that go beyond food safety and quality. The opportunities for mischief are endless. In the first WTO negotiations, the EU talked about the fourth hurdle and the precautionary principle. Fortunately, the Bush 1 team had negotiated our refusal to go along, and even though Al Gore wanted us to go back, we didn't have to when we concluded that agreement in 1993. The EU and others use technologies or resist the use of technologies that reduce the use of inputs for agricultural production. They also reduce the greenhouse gases we produce in order to protect their domestic industries. And they are a force in encouraging adoption around the world of standards that make all of the rest of us less efficient in food production. I would also say, and I was in the White House holding up a cartoon of pigs flying over the Great Wall of China when we got permanent normal trade relations with China. But we have brought the command economies into the WTO. And I am concerned that it may take generations for them to learn to behave as our rules-based trading systems expects. Finally, as supply chains develop to serve international food companies, I predict that it will become ever more challenging for family farmers in developing countries to have systems in place that guarantee food safety, food quality, and the sustainable and social standards that are becoming part of these supply chains. Even in the developed world, the integrated model will often win out unless cooperatives move quickly to meet this ever-expanding market. And finally, I would say for both Europe and the United States, we have to recognize that we no longer stand astride the world. We're no longer dominant. It used to be in Geneva that in the green room, 7 or 8 countries got together and made trade arrangements. In Seattle, one of my memories beyond the pepper spray was watching the Argentinian trade negotiator come out into the blue room and say, there are 43 countries in there discussing where to put a comma. It's very difficult to do trade negotiations as we go forward. But in the end, we need to recognize, I believe, and it's very naive to say this, but we need to think about our country's strategic economic interests and support those industries and give them preference in trade negotiations where it helps our economy compete, and at the same time take away some of the support we give to sectors that are neither strategic nor competitive in the world economy. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, John. Tom?
Thanks, Wally. Thanks for your efforts in organizing this panel. I think it's a great idea, and it's a great honor to follow Bob Zoellich and John Hardin in making some remarks. And yeah, I'll try to take a little different tack and help stimulate some discussion. I'll make 3 points. It's down from the 5 I suggested yesterday, Bob. I tried to pare it down in light of Wally's admonitions to keep it short. So point 1, so to reinforce a point Bob Zoellich just made, population and income will remain the key drivers of global change between now and 2050. But their relative importance overall and their importance between the two will change. So over the past 5 decades, we estimate about 3/4 of the 200% increase in crop output growth we've seen. So that's 200 tripling of crop output over this period, 1961 to 2006. And 3/4 of that was driven by population and income. And population was about twice as important. And this is the point John was making. Went from 3 billion to 7 billion. Okay. 2050, we're going only up to 9 billion. So it's 2 billion more, but the percentage increase is a lot less. So the relative importance of income and population is going to change. It'll be more on the income side, less on the pop side. That makes the whole growth process more vulnerable to economic growth and recession and so on. Important point to keep in mind. But those will remain the main drivers going forward to 2050 in my view. There's a real wild card here, and this is one that I've really learned by interacting with Wally Tyner on the energy side, and that is energy prices. They're a huge wild card. If you look at the U.S. forecasts of energy prices between now and 2050, the baseline suggests 3% real increases. That's a huge increase in energy prices over that period of time, and one which would make biofuels continue to be an attractive option. continuing to devote more land to biofuels, continuing to put pressure on markets. On the other hand, another future and another possibility in that Energy Information Agency forecast is that of flat real prices, and that is driven by the tremendous, the discoveries that are being made of fossil fuels, the extraction technologies that have been brought out. The fracking is a great example of that, how that has not only rendered flat but depressed natural gas prices in this country. That means cheap fertilizer. That means, in terms of if oil prices fail to increase at projected rates over this baseline, biofuels is not so interesting. So all of a sudden that takes away a big driver that we've seen over the last decade, a big driver in this regime change that Bob Zoellich was talking about. In fact, under this future, this cheap energy or not expensive energy future, we would see stronger intensification of production, leading to moderate cost of agricultural products, biofuels dwindling in importance relative to total output. And this is a future in which so the demands are less on the world's food system. It also takes us back to a future in which it's really a foot race between population and income driving demand and technology driving supply, which is where we were historically. We've fallen out of that with the biofuels boom and some of the other things. So let's go back to that for a moment and think, well, I was just saying that in our historically over this 45-year period looking back, output tripled. Going forward, we project just a mere 100% increase in crop output over this period up to 2050, focusing just on crops. There's some definitional things there, but basically much slower growth. So in this foot race between supply and demand, demand is going to be growing more slowly, particularly if biofuels don't take off. So it depends entirely on the energy future there. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Things are changing, and as we meet the world's, as population growth slows, as more and more people move into the cities and reach a level at which they are eating the pork produced on the Hardin farm, this will dwindle. That as a driver will dwindle. So thinking about that foot race, the key thing becomes technology, the ability to increase agricultural output, and that's what Purdue's all about, is new science and technology for agriculture, extending it to the farm, extending it to the world. And in that context, there are a lot of concerns about the ability to continue to increase yields. I just reviewed a book that's about to come out from Fisher, Byerly, and Ed Meades on future prospects for yield growth in the world, and they're very concerned. Yield growth in many of the world's major bread baskets is slowing, and add to that climate change, which makes it more difficult. Higher temperatures is going to make it more difficult in the tropics to increase yields. Are we reaching yield plateaus, biophysical limits at which we can no longer push out that frontier? There's a lot of concern about that, and that is fueling concern about this regime shift that we might be facing, a world of permanently higher prices, rising prices. However, what matters for food prices is not yields per se, but overall productivity. There are many other inputs to agriculture. There's labor, there's capital. Food prices depend on all of those inputs, and there is no evidence that total factor productivity of all the inputs is slowing. In fact, I met yesterday with the expert at USDA, Keith Fugly, on measurement of TFP, total factor productivity, what you get on the crop output from all the inputs you put in. And he suggests that total factor productivity has actually been accelerating in the last decade, kind of a surprising result, but it's due to the fact that it's looking at all of the inputs being used in agriculture. So if he's right, if productivity growth continues to be maintained at historical levels, while the demand driven by population income gradually diminishes as we move out to 2050 and population begins to level out and we're feeding everyone pork at that point, then
the world is filled with omnivores.
Then this is an alternative future, and I'd like to throw that out there. I think that we're in a rough patch right now. There have been a series of bad weather years in major producing regions. The stocks-to-use ratios are very low. As Bob Zoellich was pointing out, we've seen high and rising prices. And we've seen this kind of thing historically. We've seen it in the 70s. We've seen these spikes, and they persist for a number of years. But the rest of the world is responding to these higher prices. They're growing, they're expanding their area. They're investing more in intensifying their production, more fertilizer, more irrigation. There's an incentive to invest because prices are high. They were declining. They declined it by 30% over that historical period. Where will they go in the future? Are we on this upward trend? Are we going to resume that downward trend? I don't know, but I think it's a very interesting question, and I think it's one that this panel should be thinking about and you should be pressing us on. It's a complicated situation, but it has important implications. If you're an investor in farmland and you have factored into your investment the assumption that corn prices will continue to rise, you may want to diversify a little bit. There's a concern there. So I think it has implications for everyone in this room in one way or another.
Thanks, Tom.
I'll wrap up there.
Alan?
Well, first of all, Wally, thanks for asking me to be on the panel. It's a little odd to have all of these distinguished people here and then the poor farm kid from Texas in here to try to somehow follow up. I'm supposed to be the strategy guy, and I can tell you that it's a poor strategy to be the guy following all three of these folks. It'll be hard to hold up to that. So when I think about demand drivers for global agriculture, or drivers for global agriculture, I'm an economist by my training. So the first thing I do is say, well, how am I going to answer that? Let's see, I ought to figure out what shifts the demand curve and what shifts the supply curve and think about what those things are that are most likely to shift them. And so I have a few areas on the demand side that I think are things we ought to consider. By the way, I don't know necessarily which direction these things will go. And many of them are the things they've already talked about. For example, clearly one of the demand drivers is population and income growth. But to be a bit provocative, we're growing from 7 billion to 9 billion, somewhere between 2040 and 2050 we expect to be somewhere in that range. And some people say it's 9.5 billion. We don't really know the number, but we're growing to that. And today we have 1 billion people who go to bed starving every night. And it's not because we don't have enough food. So we've clearly chosen as a society not to nourish those billion people already. Why do we suddenly believe that now we have to feed the 2 billion more? I hope as an individual in humanity that we want to feed those 2 billion additional people, but we already don't feed 1 billion with the food that we produce, and it's not because we don't have enough. So that leads me to believe that population growth, while may be important, isn't nearly as important as income growth. Sure. It's the income growth that matters the most to driving that, shifting that demand curve outward and to the right. And we ought to think about what that means in terms of global GDP, global growth in people's incomes. We have, I think, a long way to go there. And as we think about income growth, of course, that drives demand in things like what types of food or dietary transitions that we might be seeing. And I want to come back to that then on the supply side in just a few minutes. The second thing that I think about when I think about, well, we have 1 billion people who go to bed hungry every night now, and we have plenty of food. It's partly an income issue, and it's partly an institutions issue. So if I thought about where demand for agriculture may go in the future, one of the things that I think is critically important is government and institutional stability as we think about that, whether we're talking about the Middle East and the stability that needs to happen there, which I think, Tom, is related to energy issues ultimately as well, and what might happen with energy prices there, which could impact us, to the recognition that while there are approximately 1 to 1.5 United States populations in the urban regions of China, there's still about 1 billion of them in poverty. That's a very difficult and unstable situation for a government to manage. We tend to presume that China is the demand that will lead agriculture to its newest prosperity. Is there perhaps an alternative that says that in China's history it has rarely had a regime that's lasted more than 100 years? Do we suddenly believe that out of 3,000 years of history that suddenly we've changed that trend? Perhaps we have not. The third driver that I have here is social perceptions of food, agriculture, and technologies. So I think about it in terms of two drivers that I believe may shift demand outward, the demand curve outward or inward, depending on how we look at that, and then also what may change the shape of that demand curve or make it more inelastic or elastic, which of course is driven partially by income, but also by the perceptions of those in the rich world as to how they want their food produced versus those in the poorer countries who want their food produced. And how we balance those over time is going to make a big difference in demand. Let me move to supply. Well, I could have a number of drivers in any one of these, but Wally said 5 minutes and looked at me because he knows I've never done anything in 5 minutes. So let me move to supply drivers. So one of the things we shouldn't forget, and I wish I had statistics, Bob's much better at that than me, at reading the statistics off the top of his head and knowing them, but this is, agriculture by and large is a commodity system. Because it's a commodity system, the key, one of the keys to supply is infrastructure and logistics investments. And where the new supplies are coming from, I hate to tell you, John, but probably not from the U.S. As we grow those, they're coming from other places. And the infrastructure that is now aging for us is lacking completely in many other places in the world. And as we think about the ways we shift supply out to keep food prices lower, investments in infrastructure and logistics seem to me to be key to those drivers. You see the investments that are happening in Brazil now, and if those things help to drive down the costs of key commodities, that could have a big impact. Second driver, and it's been mentioned before, is resource quality and availability. Increasingly, we do have supply responses. It's very clear. The prices have resulted in supply responses of bringing in more land to production. I think it's also clear that much of that land is brought into production by high prices, suggesting that it wasn't that productive to begin with, or it would have been in to begin earlier. That means that that land, in order to be productive, has to have a different set of resources, an additional set of resources. In some places, it's places where we don't have enough water. In some places, it's lacking nutrients and has less fertility. That means we need more demand for fertilizer than we currently have. And the third place where I think we'll have to really think carefully about resources is in human capital. That increasingly this is a complicated market, a complicated environment where we have lots of multinationals working that have requirements associated with them, and yet we expect to increase production in places where the human capital may not be there to be able to compete effectively in that marketplace. Of course, that leads us to technology and the ability to have technology, and I won't mention much about that because it's already been said here, but clearly supply side is about how we adopt technology. The fourth and the last one, because I don't want to use up all of our time here, that I think is critically important is access to credit. In my limited travels around the world, it's shocking to me, being an American and really inbred in an American society where I don't think farmers have struggled much in all of my career here with access to credit. And seeing what the impacts of access to credit are in places in the world where it's very difficult to get it has really changed my view of how important that is. Argentina is my example where I've spent a lot of time. There's a place that clearly has all of the productive resources that are needed to be a powerhouse in production. But due to government influences, the lack of access to credit has stopped the ability to adopt technology at the rate they could adopt it, one, and two, has caused them to make choices that clearly would not normally make good economic sense to make in a farming environment where you have that kind of productivity. And of course, I've seen that in many other places in the world, whether we're talking about Southeast Asia, the Philippines, even in Brazil up until recently. And my comment on that as it relates to agribusiness. The structural shift that I see, Bob, that makes me most nervous is that because the governments and institutions haven't been able to fill that gap very well in many parts of the world with respect to access to credit, the multinationals are stepping in to do so. They are, for example, the ABCDs, are the biggest customers of the Syngentas and Monsantos in the world. They are buying the seeds, the genetics, the fertilizers, the chemicals from these companies and providing them to farmers in return for those farmers providing all of that output back to those ABCDs. And that makes me a bit nervous. That's a pretty controlling environment where, because we don't have access to credit, the markets are stepping in to do that. And then that leads me back, John, to do we have the human capital in the world to be able to compete effectively in production agriculture when they're limited in some of these fashions and we see multinationals stepping in?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with questions from the audience, and I believe there are mics. Anybody want to start? Right here. There's a mic coming to you.
And maybe if people could just introduce themselves.
So please introduce yourself.
My name is Jules Janik, and I'm in the horticulture department. And I'm wondering, if we're worried about producing enough food for the world, why are we fooling around with biofuels?
Do you want to accumulate some questions, Wally? Or
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Next question.
See if there are some.
My question, I'm David Bacias, I'm a PhD student in AgEcon here. My question relates to the new trade agreements between the US and the EU, and I was wondering, is there actually a chance of US agriculture being freely traded between us nations, or is that more of a pipe dream going in the future?
Good question.
Others? Yeah.
Tahir Abdullahi, IITA, Nigeria. My question relates to agricultural endowment. There's one new phenomenon happening with the land grabbing. Countries are trying to expand their land endowment by getting land in Africa in particular. How will that affect global trade? And I would like your views on that one.
All very good questions.
Okay, why don't, Bob, maybe you start with the trade. Tom, do you want to take the biofuels? Sure. If you don't, I will.
Yeah, I know. You got my back.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me start with the trade, but then I'll comment on maybe the land grabbing too. On the EU-US arrangement, let me start with the point that, you know, I generally favor any effort to try to open markets and to sort of add to the structural reforms that I think are important for all the countries that they often use trade to guide. And so in concept, I'm very supportive of the US-EU agreement. Having said that, I've also lived in the world, as John has, of trying to get these things through a political process. And John kind of opened the door to this. Under the US Constitution, trade policy is the province of the Congress. We have the Senate, which has 2 senators from each state, which means that if you have a lot of ag states, you probably have a disproportionate weight of agricultural policy relative to other issues. And surprise, surprise, the ag community since the 30s has been pretty well organized in these topics. Mm-hmm. So agriculture is very important in driving trade policy, and that's why, as John mentioned, it's very important when you have those in the ag community that are basically want to open markets as opposed to, say, sugar, who basically are looking to try to figure out how to close markets. In the context of the US-EU agreement, one of the big challenges will be that I expect that the US agricultural community would say what they would have said to me when I was doing this 6 or 7 years ago, which is, look, we negotiated to open up the beef market in the global negotiations, and it's blocked by hormones policy. We negotiated to open up poultry, and it's blocked by chlorine policies. We negotiated to open up grains, and it's blocked by biotech. So those are all, of anybody who knows the European context, those are all very sensitive issues. Now, are there ways around those? I think this is, again, will be the challenge for having the right creativity for the negotiators and the right will to push them forward. And I think the answer is yes, possibly. And let me just give you one. At the time when I was USTR, we had already had this problem with beef, and we'd won a case against the EU because their hormone policy did not match the scientific standards that were supposed to be used under the WTO. But the way trade policy works, and the US welcomes this too, is if you lose a case, it doesn't mean you automatically have to change your policy. You still have your sovereignty. You can compensate by allowing other trade barriers, which is presumably what you don't want. So we were trying to negotiate with the EU to say, okay, how could we deal with the politics of Europe but expand the market? And one option that we discussed was to increase some of the tariff rate quotas, so this would be some of the meat that could come into Europe, and have the increase be large enough for hormone-free beef that it would be economical for the US beef industry to do some specialization in hormone-free beef. And I forget exactly whether the Cattlemen or the American Meat Institute, one was supportive, but the other wasn't. And the real issue came down to is we couldn't quite get the volume increase enough to convince the US beef and meat industry that this is worth their while. Well, possibly in a free trade agreement, you might be able to do that. Now, I'm not current, I don't know the exact point, but my larger point here is that one of the challenges in agriculture in trade negotiations is that it goes to the heart of societies. It goes to the heart of their sense of basic security. You know, when the US did something like block our soybean exports to Japan in the 70s, this was really dumb for our long-term interests, because if you're trying to convince people they can rely on open markets, we just sort of violated our own sort of rule. As John mentioned, in many of these economies, given their own sort of agricultural situation, you might be able to deal with, in a sense, lower their costs as well as dealing with the sensitivities. And so, to switch to the Asian context, which you mentioned, the US negotiated a free trade agreement with Korea. Well, you know, part of this was a question of Korean rice farmers are one of the most sensitive constituencies they have. Well, I believe in that agreement they kind of excluded rice. You know, maybe that wouldn't have been my sort of first preference, but the question is whether with Japan or Korea, can you do something that as farmers get older, you could change the nature of the support and sort of open up some of these markets. So what I'm really describing to you is you can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And you have to find solutions to some of these. So to reverse it, you know, the United States excluded sugar from the Australian Free Trade Agreement, which is something I hated to do, but we suffer from Napoleon's inventiveness. And what this amounts to is, prior to Napoleon, most sugar came from cane. But because sugar was a very important commodity, he helped develop beet sugar. And this was part of the continental economic system. Beet sugar spread to the United States. So as opposed to just having a few states that represent cane sugar, we have a lot of states that represent beet sugar. And therefore, we have a lot of senators in the sugar caucus. And it's just darn hard to get them to open up that market. So the point, I think, is coming back to your idea, whether it's Asia, the United States, or Europe, agriculture is a very demanding area. But we've found at different times ways that you can come up with solutions. Just to give another one, Wally and I were talking. He was, when I was USTR, we negotiated a free trade agreement with Morocco. And Wally had a number of students that were on the Moroccan side, and he was trying to help them with some of the analysis. And he reminded me that we were trying to get a beef opening in Morocco. And we came up with the creative solution of saying, well, we'll start to open up the market in ways that will go to some of the high-end hotels for Western European and other travelers, which wouldn't necessarily be a market that that the local producers were trying to target anyway. So these aren't perfect, they're a little structured, but I guess what I keep emphasizing, putting back into the larger context that we discussed today, is that My view is, given the types of changes, and we've had a good discussion here a little bit about the productivity and sort of different aspects of demand, you're going to want to have more open markets rather than less. And in particular, just to give you the flip side, when I was president of the World Bank and we saw prices start to spike in 2007 and 2008, which started actually with a rice tender, a failed rice tender in the Philippines. And rice is a very thinly traded international commodity, only about 7%. And so this led to a big spike. What exacerbated it was then people putting export restrictions on it. And it got to the point where even humanitarian agencies like the World Food Program couldn't buy their supplies because of the restrictions put on. So part of my larger message is, given where I think the world is shifting, we actually need to move towards sort of more open markets, but also ways to help manage some of the volatility and shortages. And some of this comes back to the point on the financing aspects too. The irony is, you know, in many aspects of Washington, you know, derivatives are seen as a terribly nasty thing. And I have to point out in some groups that I'm from Illinois, you know, we used to call futures for farm products derivatives, right? You know, and so do you want to take away a farmer's ability to lock in a price for corn or soybeans or whatever? And so some of these, what's interesting is in many developing countries, they don't have access to these risk management tools. So one of the things we tried to do through the private sector arm of the World Bank was to expand actually the access to financial tools to help them with risk management. Since I went on long enough, why don't we...
John, why don't you...
Can I just tag on with maybe 3-4 very quick thoughts about the European Union? We used to say that the European Common Agricultural Policy was what the French desired and what they could get the Germans to pay for. And it's roughly triple the amount of subsidy we had in the United States. And when the agreement and they expanded the EU to many more countries, the only way they could continue to support those prices was to close the doors, to block markets on the things they produced there. And the second thing about negotiating with the Europeans, when you've got 20 countries that fight it out to what their position's going to be, when they come to the trade negotiation, it's very hard for them to compromise any further. So 2 comments, and the things that are particularly pernicious about beyond what I spoke of earlier, you know, they're now wanting geographic indicators. And I just think the potential for mischief here makes it very challenging to move an EU FTA in food. And I would just add, you know, we're not without sin here in the Midwest, because high fructose corn syrup benefited from high sugar prices. Mm-hmm. So you just added a few more senators and congressmen
effective ones
to make that work. Now, final comment about going to other markets, just an anecdote. The Chinese, shortly after we got permanent normal trade relations and we began to ship meat into the high-quality hotels, they came to us with a problem. The boxes that shipped the prime beef tenderloins were being reused. They had a market of about $10 a box. So you could buy cheap beef and put it in an American box, and all of a sudden it became American. And somehow or another, we had to police that. I found that fascinating. But economics really works.
Really works.
Thank you.
Tom, you want to
Sure.
start on biofuels at least?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, bioenergies have been around since the beginning of time. Firewood, charcoal, it's going to be around forever. It comes in and out of play depending on prices for alternative fuels, depending on government policies. And I think what we've seen over the last decade is there was a period during which this looked like a win-win-win-win-win. In the sense, there was an article published in 2007 in Science magazine documenting the great greenhouse gas emissions benefits of corn ethanol. And it wasn't until the program got underway and that people started to think about the broader implications, the global implications, the implications for land use and so on, and the expense in terms of some of these programs and the cost that's often passed on to consumers. Europeans have backed off of this dramatically. And in the US, my word from Wally is we're at the the level of ethanol production we will see for the near foreseeable future. So that's going to dwindle in relative importance. So maybe it's seen this particular one, you're thinking biofuels, you're thinking corn ethanol, biodiesel, and so on, and it may have seen its heyday here during this period, particularly if oil prices stay low and budgets are tight. Maybe something we'll look back at historically. And I don't know whether you want to add something to that, Wally, or others want to comment.
Let me just add a couple of points to that, and I'll tie it with Tahiru's point about land grab. What we hear about in biofuels all the time is what biofuels and all these other drivers that you've heard about this morning are doing to ag commodity prices. That is, their commodity prices are higher, partly because of biofuels, partly because of all these other drivers that are out there in the global market. And there's no doubt that particularly for poor urban consumers around the world, this is a huge problem. But the World Bank says that 70% of the world's poor live in rural areas in developing countries and derive their primary livelihood from agriculture. And after having had 2 decades of relatively flat cropland base in the world, in the last 6 years with these higher commodity prices, we've seen 70 million hectares of agricultural cropland added, not in the United States, not in Europe, not in Canada, but in developing countries around the world. And so there is opportunity if we get the credit right, if we get the technology transfer right. If it's done right, there's opportunity for these higher commodity prices to actually provide increases in well-being, reductions in poverty for rural areas in developing countries. Now to the land grab part. I just reviewed a book entitled Biofuels and Rural Poverty. And the whole book is about doing it right. And if it's done with land grabs so that the smallholders don't keep the title to their land, it's not going to work. It's not going to reduce rural poverty. So there is potential that these higher prices, as others have said, markets work. Farmers have responded. Farmers will continue to respond. But we have to have the institutions in place, the credit and the extension or technology transfer institutions, and the property rights institutions that protect the smallholders. Those are all perhaps big ifs, but there is at least the potential to see something positive come out of this for rural holders in other areas. Questions? More questions?
Can I just come back, because I didn't want to go too long, but just real briefly on the biofuels. What I would add is this, and I agree with what Tom and Wally said, but I live at the intersection of kind of the policy and the markets and the politics, and I guess I would say if we think that ethanol is a good thing to develop, so do we need a mandate, a subsidy, and a limit, a tariff to stop it from coming in? Nope. Those would seem to me to be a contradictory set of policies. Now, the good news is, under budget pressure and others, actually, Congress has changed those, I think. So it's changed the subsidy and it's cut the tariff. I do think the one other aspect that Wally and I discussed is that there will be, and this kind of connects back to the technology point, there will be an interest in this field of whether you need to support some of the base so as to get the infrastructure with the hope that eventually you'd move to some cellulosic ethanol. And if that can be done, and that's sort of beyond my scientific or technological capabilities, that could also be a very big influence, because I want to come back to something Tom mentioned. One of the things we saw over the past 10 years is the correlation between energy and food prices became very tight. Some of this was ethanol-based, but some of it is fertilizer-based, some of it is transport-based. So in a sense, if you could develop some alternative sort of cellulosic type of ethanol, that could be a very significant dimension of this. On the land grab, I just want to come back to Allan's point about governance and institutions. When I was at the bank, we did some analysis with various countries on this. And I didn't want to be kind of sort of totally resistant to the notion I mean, again, I remember that there were people in Iowa when I was growing up that thought, well, we can't allow foreigners to buy farmland because, I don't know, they're going to take it and steal it, I guess. But and you know, that
Bring it back home with them.
interferes with the notion of instead of trying to allow the market to reflect the values and capital investment. But one does have to be very careful about the land rights and kind of how it fits your overall development strategy. So if my numbers recollect, only about 20% of agricultural land in sub-Saharan Africa is registered in any form. So you got a big danger here about people kind of losing their property to big, powerful people in the government. Secondly, the average farm size in sub-Saharan Africa has actually shrunk over the past decades. It's now about 2.1 hectares, which is pretty darn small. And that what that does mean is that if you're going to try to set up some of the types of value chain we're talking about, you need, as a policy and institution matter, to realize you're going to need a much sort of deeper interconnected chain. But there's things you can do if you have this on your policy agenda that make a difference. And just to give you sort of an example of this in a different dimension, the World Bank, when I was there, did a land titling experiment with Ethiopia. And here, this didn't cost any dollars at all, but we simply worked with the Ethiopian government to put room for 2 names on the land titles. And all of a sudden, women became co-owners of the land. And all of a sudden, women had access to credit that they might not have had, access to different types of inputs. So I think coming back to the land grab, on the one hand, you could have the possibility of people bringing in capital, knowledge, technology, connect to export markets. There could be good things. But I don't think one can do this blindly, and this is why I think Allan's point is one of the things I've experienced over the years is while I have a strong sense of sort of markets and how they work, you also have to connect them with institutions and governance.
John?
Quickly, Jules, you always get to the heart of the matter. Thank you. I served on a committee once with the chief economic strategist for Cargill. He was a Yale-Oxford product. And he said there's a hierarchy of value in agricultural production. Food, feed, and fuel, absent subsidy. And I think for those commodities that where the potential is food, and at least food and maybe feed, and the last spike in 2008 basically performed a $30 billion cashectomy on the livestock industry in the United States. So I think for true biofuels, algae, all the other things, maybe we'll get the technology right. I don't know. 30 years ago, cellulosic ethanol was only 5 or 6 years down the road, and it still is. So those things need to be accounted for, but high prices cure a lot of things, and it's brought pressure to sub-Saharan Africa. All of these things matter.
That ranking might or might not hold with $100 oil, John.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and actually, Wally, I just wanted to comment on both of those 2 issues again, too. With biofuels, to me, is an interesting prospect or interesting idea because, in the end, everything is about energy. Because we talk about calorie consumption. When we talk about feeding people and their income, calories are a measure of energy. Feed that we feed to animals is energy. We have 2 choices. We actually only have 1 choice for energy. That's the sun. That's where it all comes from. We have 2 choices of how we harvest that energy. One is the sun energy that was harvested billions of years ago that's underneath the earth that we pull out of it now and call it fossil fuels. And the other way we do it is through crops that absorb the sun's sunlight. And I think the thing that Wally was the one who said this. I need to attribute it to him, but it's stuck with me ever since. This is about forms of energy. And the form of the energy gets dictated by the income of those who can pay. Now, that has a lot of implications to it, right? But if we have those who can pay that want the form of that energy in the form of crop-based energies that we consume for food, so be it. If we have a demand for that energy in the form of feed to feed it to animals that convert that energy to a different form for the human to consume, or if we need that energy converted to some sort of a liquid form that burns in a automobile, or to produce electricity for that human and their income can decides to pay for that, then so be it. To me, they're all very connected to each other. And we could say, why do we have a biofuels policy? And I would say, why do we have a policy to get the Chinese to eat more meat? That's clearly an energy demander that is shifting energy and making crop prices higher. The economics dictates what form the energy gets converted to. That's the way I see that biofuels piece. And the last thing is on the land grab thing, and I don't pretend to know much about this, but I remember reading a couple articles about Chile. And when Chile reformed their land rights, and the judgment of these papers got it right, the productivity of Chile and its ability to deliver on the needs of the world, not just itself, changed dramatically. And I would go back to Bob's comment on that. The land rights issue is a very, very big deal, I think, going forward.
Other question, one back here. All the way to the back.
Josh Merrill, Dow Sciences. What role change do you see or would you like to see for agriculture input companies, outside of just continued investment in biotech and chemistry?
Right here, down this way.
I'm Yang Xuan Liu. I'm from Purdue Agriculture Economics Department. And my question is, as Allan agreed, you talk about human capital for the future demand in this area, as the youth and next generation in this area. My question is, what you have suggested us to acquire, what skills you have suggested us to acquire to meet the future demand for this area, for the agriculture? I would like to hear some ideas from academia and from business and also from World Bank, if I can. Thank you.
One more, right here.
Beth, and then maybe two.
Hey, I'm Toba Matsaloa. My affiliation with ecological science and engineering, agricultural economics, own department. I guess my question is on credit crisis, particularly as it relates with developing countries, and most in particular, Sub-Saharan Africa. Looking at the credit situation in Sub-Saharan Africa, we discovered that there is a lot of reasons why the credit is not readily available. One is religious reasons, one is cultural reasons. However, looking at the risk in which the farmers in Sub-Saharan Africa have to bear, and there's no insurance kind of, fallback on that you can easily fall back on. Like for instance, in the US, the drought last year, if the farmers had problems, the government got that back. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, if farmers get credit and things go bad, there's no insurance for them. And not until there's an institution, either governmental or corporate body, that can absorb that risk, I don't think, marketers or corporate bodies will be interested in giving credit to these guys. Thank you.
Okay, last one right here.
Beth Bechtel, I'm with Ice Miller law firm in Indianapolis. My question has to do with government engagement and policy, but not a farm bill or trade policy, but tied to the regulatory landscape. The more you talk to farmers and agribusiness companies today, when you hear about concerns that they have related to their engagement with government, it's becoming more a concern about over-regulation. And whether that's FDA and a sweeping Food Safety Modernization Act that now has impacts on grain elevators and feed mills, our slow, cumbersome biotech approval process, EPA, Department of Labor, tax, financial services regulations, the list just keeps going on and on and on. And so the question, is there a real risk of government over-regulation jeopardizing our competitiveness in food and agricultural production?
Okay, we're going ask the panel to be relatively brief in your answers. Allan, I'm going to ask you to start with Josh's question on ag business, but I want to amend it just a little bit and say, in addition to the role and how it could best work, are there things that we need to be doing to make this ag business supply chain you talked about pro-poor in developing countries?
Poor, yeah. First, Josh, thanks for the question. Good to see you. Except I can barely see you, frankly, but hello anyway. Look, the first answer that I give to that is do what you do best, and what you do best is technology. So yes, keep investing in technologies. Why would you try to do a lot more than that in this role? I think it's a very important role that agribusiness has in terms of technologies. But I would say that if I had an advice for agribusiness with respect to the technology, I would like to see us, I think most of our agribusiness companies are multinational, they're not global. And I would rather see us have a much more global perspective. So what I see is most of our technologies are mostly rich country view technology driven activities, and that our companies don't have a global enough view. I'll give you an example. Hybrid rice it has real potential in many parts of the world, but I've witnessed some of the adoption or attempted to adopt that in the Philippines by many companies that would like to see that adopted with no real solid understanding of the social fabric and the societal implications of adopting that in places like the Philippines, where clearly in the Philippines for the moment, labor is not the issue, whereas hybrid rice may help us manage labor in India. That's not the issue in the Philippines, and I see often our multinationals have their sort of particular national view of things and don't really recognize how their technologies play with society and the environment in various places in the world, and growing that global view would be important. And I think, Wally, that perspective is the way I would say how we think about being pro-poor in a lot of ways. Being pro-poor is also about understanding society and how those technologies impact those poor societies and how it interplays with being able to increase the wealth and capacity of pro-poor. Another place where we have some opportunity to do this, and frankly on the input supply side where a Dow would be, I have a harder time figuring out the value proposition, but in a Nestle, for example, where they spend a great deal of time in educating farmers in those poorest regions where they access things like cocoa, for example, where they help in those tropical areas, those folks understand technology adoption, help them adopt technologies that increases the income and the livelihood of those farmers in those regions. There's a company that shows an example of a pro-poor approach to things. Clearly the value proposition to Nestle makes a lot of sense because they can then take that and market that in their final products of this is what we do for the poor of the world, and they extract rents from that from those consumers who are willing to pay for that. For Dow, for Syngenta, for Monsanto, that's a little bit tougher place to be, and we have to think more about what the value proposition is there, but certainly education in the poor areas.
John, would you be willing to take the start on Beth's question on regulatory?
All right, and I'll start, Beth, and thank you for the question. Somebody said that, I forget which document was, 300 words in the U.S. historical canon, whether it was Gettysburg Address or whatever, and there are 15,000 that regulate the sale of cabbage. I guess I pose some caution, but I think that we're making an honest attempt to look at what makes sense, and I hope we are. The one thing that concerns me in most rural dialogues right now is a refusal to confront what I think is a scientific reality and the coming of climate change. And at some point in time, we're going to have to think about how we do that at our peril if we don't. And so I guess I think we need to have some balance there about how we deal with problems that are bigger than us, and at the same time move forward. But yes, there are some challenges, but I hope we can have a constructive dialogue as we go forward, unless you just want to say what we have in Congress right now is constipation rather than anything moving, to really make something happen good for our economy and society.
I think the other two questions will come up in the last question that I'm going to ask you, and if they don't, then add something to those other two questions. But in thinking about or preparing your last 5 minutes of remarks to summarize, I'd like you to think about what one or two policy changes rich and poor countries could implement that you think would have the greatest benefit for global producers and consumers. Because after all, the objective of the production is consumption at the end. So what can we do? What are the things that you think are the top of your list? Is it credit? Is it institutions? What is it that you think, or trade, or any of the other things that you've mentioned, and a little bit about how you would go about trying to move forward on it? Anybody want to volunteer to start? Tom, why don't you start?
Okay, that's a big challenge. Yeah, I would like to tie it into the question about risk, and particularly in Africa, particularly risk in agriculture. So yeah, let me pick one of the policy items that I think we need to come to grips with, and that is, as John said, climate. We need to come to grips with the prospect of very serious climate change. So recent economic analyses of the climate change problem, recognizing that it's very hard to know what the impact of this accumulation of greenhouse gases is going to be. But if there's a remote possibility that the kinds of things that could happen, the worst case scenario could happen, the economically rational thing to do, just like you buy insurance on your house, you invest money now in order to, under the precautionary principle that this could lead to a very bad outcome. I think we need to start moving on this front in a modest way. We've done some studies about the contribution that agriculture, forestry, avoided deforestation could contribute to slowing the accumulation of greenhouse gases. And this could have potentially very beneficial impact for agriculture. Also could reverse the things I said earlier on about food prices. But I think it is important we begin thinking seriously about this, and we need to engage the developing countries in this process because there's a lot of potential low-cost mitigation in developing countries. Avoided deforestation is prime amongst those. Absent, I think in any case, the wheels are set in motion for some type of climate change and more likely more extreme events, and likely those will have the most severe impacts in Africa, throughout the tropics, where the systems are already at their temperature limit. There's less scope for adjusting. There's less scope for adaptation. So coming to grips with this increased riskiness potentially of agricultural production is going to be very important. And the World Bank has a number of initiatives underway on this. For example, weather index insurance, where farmers could insure against against drought, for example, in their region, something that they can't insure through informal means because everyone is hit by that event. But in general, I would say I think we need to pay more attention to the climate change issue because it could be a real disaster for many people in the world, particularly in the poorest parts of the world who can't shield themselves from that. Very modest investments today could pay big dividends in the future, and agriculture should be part of that process. There's a lot of potential for agriculture to contribute to that, and it could benefit farmers, and it could benefit the poor in developing countries potentially. I'll leave that.
Thank you. Allan.
I'm going to focus. Wally puts me in a tough spot. I was raised as a policy analyst, which means alternatives and consequences, not here's what I think you should do as a policy. So that's a tough spot for me. But
your instincts are right. I'm glad. That's appropriate.
I think that I'm going to couch this in the concept of the human capital issue. And I would tell you that it's my perspective, and perhaps naive and even biased, I will admit that, but I think one of the greatest impacts that has ever happened for global agriculture is the land-grant university model. I watched last night when I got home really late from a program, and I apologize for not being at dinner last night because I was committed to something else, but I decided last night I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about this. I watched Lincoln last night, the movie. It didn't even talk about it in the movie there, but it reminded me that during the Civil War was when we debated the land-grant university model that is yet still today the greatest model of technology transfer and education of the people of a country in the world. If I had a policy, if I had the ability to make a policy around the world, I would have some version of a land-grant university system scattered about the world to focus on increasing the global human talent pool to answer the questions that this society has to answer about how to feed, clothe, fuel the people of the world. And I think that we need to find ways to get that education more globally in areas like, first of all, global perspectives. Something I shared with Wally last week that I'm just now getting it. I'm 43 years old and just now starting to see that there's something beyond Texas. And I've been in Indiana 15 years and just now realize it's beyond Texas, but going beyond that to understand the globe and the issues in the world. So getting young people to understand from a global perspective, understanding technology, application, and design. Both of those things are going to be critical to the future of the human capital. And the third thing that I would tell you is that this is a trajectory that nobody can predict. It's going to have ups and downs and uncertainties without any question. That's probably the only thing we can predict. The human skill sets to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity are a particular set of skills that I think we have a responsibility to figure out how to help people all around the world learn how to function in uncertainty and ambiguity. So my policy would be something about education. The land-grant university model was a policy that I'm still dumbfounded by how our leaders knew to do something like that and the impact that it's had. I can't think of any other policy that's had that kind of impact.
Thank you. John?
Just a quick two historical asides. When in the summer of 1862, when they passed the Morrill Act, the Confederate armies were essentially in what are now the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the fact that we put together what Lincoln called a system of people's universities is just amazing to me.
Unbelievable.
Second historical fact. I'm reminded that when the Belgians left the Congo, there were 30 college graduates in that huge country of so many resources. I think morally we have a responsibility as part of the rich world to attempt to redress some of the things that happened there. The third comment I'll make, many of these projections about how much ag demand and how much more we need to feed the world are based on an assumption that we're going to continue to have peace. And we've been so long without a major conflict that the world has forgot what the consequences of that are. And so, and in the rich world, from the area I come from, we could at least stop the things that prevent access to products from the poor world into our trading economies. And from that, build something beyond. Now, I don't have the expertise of any of the other people here, and that's why I give general answers. But I hope those are things that you can think about.
Bob?
Well, I'm glad Allan, as a Texan, has come to recognize the genius of Abraham Lincoln.
Well said.
It shows that he is expanding his horizons. Time in Indiana has been well spent. And you'll be interested, Allan, when my remarks later today, I actually am going to refer to some of these points and in a broader sense, because there was a spurt of legislation in 1862 that actually, you could argue, was key to the economic modernization of the United States. And I was at a seminar at Harvard earlier this week, and people were talking about the impasse in the Congress, and they said, well, how did this happen? And I said, well, actually the key was with secession, all the Southern Democrats left, and the Republican Party, which was the descent of the Whig Party and was able to pass all the legislation. So I'm not sure I recommend secession as a way of breaking the law. Anyway, let me touch on 3 points. One, a word on human capital, a second on credit, and then some policy. Because I think the human capital point is really important one. I agree very much with Allan, but I'll just go even one step deeper. What you see around the world, and I've spent so many, days and months in developing countries and often some very poor areas, a lot of agriculture areas, is the willingness of people to want to improve their lives is so strong. And frankly, the start is just kind of giving them a chance, this is where the governance, the property rights, sort of the basic opportunity to sell. And now with information technology, you're starting to see possibilities of leapfrogging sort of old structures. And in a way, what I was going to say independently about this, but it fits the land-grant colleges, is the extension services. Extension services can be critical in sort of delivering this capacity. Second, I think the credit point is really fundamental. And again, to give you a practical example, when the financial crisis hit, one of the things that I was alert to because of my trade background was a lot of the banks started to pull back trade finance. And we actually came up with some tools with our private sector arm, but actually leveraging some of the banks to get back in because actually it was the developing world, including for things like agricultural exports, that just didn't have that basic access. But the broader point here, and again, it comes time to the governance, access to finance is in partly sort of collateral, it's partly property rights, it's partly sort of recognizing the value of these systems. So former President Zedillo of Mexico made a comment to me once that I've always sort of kept in mind. He said, people talk about sort of the influence of markets on the poor. He said, my concern is that markets don't extend enough to the poor. In other words, these are the people who are left out. These are the people that have to pay usury rates. These are the people that don't have access to the system. And again, to give you an example from Africa, Kenya, with the expansion of mobile telephones, which has gone from 10 to 20 million 10 years ago to 5 to 600 million today, was an innovator in using those phones to start to provide financial services and in a sense, going back to your regulatory question, because the old regulatory system was based on landlines, the whole mobile telephony sort of bypassed it and drew about $70 billion of private investment. But having said that, your comment about the risks is one that I've pondered a lot. And I'll share with you another account. I once sat down with the Indian Central Bank, and we were talking about some of the issues, and this may be surprising coming from a central banker, but he was talking about some of the small Indian farmers that were setting themselves on fire or committing suicide. And he said, these aren't the subsistence farmers. These are the people that are just starting to move into the market economy, and maybe they take out a little loan to try to get a pump for water. They don't find water, and they've got no hope. They're left out. So the question is, how can we try to give some support and insurance to those people without, frankly, sort of backbreaking budgetary subsidies, which we and the Europeans have used? Now, the crop insurance model is interesting. Frankly, even the U.S. one is pretty well subsidized, and so it's a little hard to think about that. But I think if you broaden it and think about risk management more generally, you come up with some interesting ideas. And again, just to give you some color on this, one of the things that we learned at the World Bank, we had a project in Niger where you could have used risk insurance for some of the diseases, but we put in a special animal surveillance project to look at the diseases, and it was far more effective in terms of heading off the problem, managing the risk, if you will, than trying to sort of just use the pure financial insurance. Or in some parts of the world, there was one, the Los Plateaux in China, where it was a real issue of water risk because the dryness in China. And by trying to deal with free-ranging goats and some land tenure issues, we were able to start to build the water capacity. Similarly, in forestation projects in different areas, which have the carbon benefit but also water hazards. So I think the issue that you identify of sort of risk management as people moving in, a combination of financial and non-financial, I think is very important going through. And then the last point on the policy side is, I guess I'd say, one, Open markets. With all these changes, one thing I can darn well assure you is that by stopping exports, making things more costly for your people, that's not going to work. And frankly, doing it in a way that then avoids some of the volatility and the shortages. But secondly, helping to manage the risks of the volatility, and particularly for sort of small players in the system. Some of this is financial, some of it's non-financial. The third is increasing information availability. I mean, people in the United States get used to the incredible resources of information we have. Long-range weather forecasting is something you really don't have as much in sub-Saharan Africa. So we were working with the World Meteorological Organization and others because, it can at least help people try to prepare for some of these eventualities. This key theme we've talked about increasing productivity without expanding acreage. And I like the way that Tom talked about this. I was focused on the value chain, but I think particularly for a university like Purdue, this is a wonderful example of how do you have science, innovation, and systems to kind of help to connect this. And investing in climate-smart agriculture. Part of this is adaptation. One thing we didn't get into today, but I think has got rich potential, is soil carbon. And I talked a little bit about this with Tom. This could be a triple win. I mean, this could be something that could help mitigate, it could help actually strengthen the soil with its carbon, and it actually could have other benefits in terms of sort of water retention. And just to give you a rough sense, Tom mentioned avoided deforestation. This is a classic of where policy and institutions intersect. I think soil carbon is sort of where avoided deforestation was 10 years ago. What I meant by that was people were estimating avoided deforestation might absorb, say, 17% of the necessary greenhouse gases. But the question is, how do you institutionalize it? If you're going to pay somebody for not cutting down a forest, how do you make sure that they don't cut down a forest somewhere else? How do you monitor it? How do you deal with the indigenous people living in the forest? So there's practical questions. There's a similar set of questions about how to make soil carbon work. And again, for a university like this one that covers institutions, farming, technology, I think it's a wonderful way to make a difference. And that leads to the last point. What I've seen in this field, and I'll close this is a good closing point, is, and I'm sure John encountered this too. Surprisingly, to a policy person that comes from a general background as I do, the ag community, the nutrition community, the hunger community, they're all very separate communities. They barely talk to each other. And yet the types of things we've talked about, plus adding science and technology and energy, require a multidisciplinary outlook. And again, that's a wonderful possibility for a university like this one. You have the potential to interconnect these things and then add into it issues like public health, global governance, because one of the things you learn as a problem solver is there's no one silver bullet. It's kind of trying to get the pieces to fit together in an effective way.
Wow. Have you gotten your money's worth? Our theme was the future of global agriculture. We didn't tell you what that future is going to be, but we told you it's going to be uncertain. And we told you a lot, or the panelists told you a lot about what are the key things to look at, what are the key drivers, what are the key issues, what are the important policy questions. So there's a lot to think about, a lot of those of you who are students to do research on and help us move towards a brighter future in the future. So this has been, I think, absolutely phenomenal exchange. We've had the advantage of some of the best people in the world to talk about this. Let's thank them. I invite you to rejoin us here at 1:30. Mr. Zoellich's lecture is entitled Changing Global Economy of the 21st Century, Prospects and Challenges. So you're in light for even better, even more.